The rifle surfaced quietly, as most forgotten things do. It arrived wrapped in oil-stained cloth, its wood darkened by age and weather, its metal dulled but intact. There were no markings to announce its importance, no plaque or note to explain where it had been. Only a tag tied with twine, recovered after the war. For decades, the conflict had been dissected in books and documentaries. Maps were redrawn, numbers debated, victories claimed and disputed. Yet the individuals who fought it, especially those from indigenous communities, were often reduced to footnotes or statistics. This rifle was believed to have belonged to one of them. A sniper, according to fragmented reports. Highly effective. Nearly invisible. Feared by enemies and spoken of in hushed tones even among allies. Investigators didn't expect much. Old weapons usually tell simple stories. Serial numbers filed off, barrels worn smooth, stocks chipped from years of use. This one appeared no different at first glance. The bolt still slid cleanly. The trigger, though stiff, functioned. Whoever carried it had maintained it with care, even in the chaos of war. But something felt wrong, too balanced, too deliberate. The rifle weighed slightly more than it should have. X-rays were ordered, routine more than curiosity. When the images appeared on the screen, the room fell silent. Not because of what was obvious, but because of what wasn't. The internal cavity of the stock showed irregularities, small voids where there should have been solid wood. Hand-carved, precise, intentional. The rifle was moved to a secure lab. Conservators worked slowly, removing layers of grime and old resin. Every step was documented, every shaving preserved. As the stock was carefully opened, the smell of old cedar filled the room, sharp and unmistakable. Inside was not ammunition, not tools, not contraband. Instead, there were objects wrapped in faded cloth, each one placed with care, each one worn smooth by touch. A carved token bearing symbols unfamiliar to most of the team. A thin strip of leather, etched with tally marks, notched unevenly, as if recording something that could not be spoken aloud. A small bundle of herbs, long dried but still fragrant, bound with SINEW. No one spoke. The presence of these items suggested planning far beyond survival. This was not a hiding place born of desperation. It was deliberate ceremonial. The rifle had not only been a weapon, it had been a vessel. As historians were called in, old oral accounts began to surface. Stories passed down quietly, stories that never made it into official records. Of warriors who carried not just rifles, but responsibilities. Of snipers who believed each shot required balance, intention, and remembrance. Of battles fought not only against an enemy, but against erasure. One investigator noted that the tally marks didn't align with confirmed kills. Another pointed out that the symbols matched no known military code. Linguists suggested the carvings resembled protective motifs used in rites meant to guide spirits, not harm them. The rifle, it seemed, was never just about precision or lethality. It carried memory, identity. Burden. As word spread, pressure mounted. Museums requested access. Governments asked questions. Descendant communities demanded consultation. The rifle was suddenly no longer an artifact. It was a voice, one that had been silent for generations. Late one evening, alone in the lab, an investigator returned to the open stock. There was one final layer beneath the cloth, nearly missed. Something etched directly into the wood itself, hidden where only the bearer would ever see it. A message, or perhaps a warning, carved slowly, deliberately, by someone who knew the war would end. But the story would not. The rifle had been forgotten, not because it lacked importance, but because history often chooses what it wants to remember. It lay for years in storage, passed between hands that never paused long enough to ask whose hands had once held it with purpose. When it finally resurfaced, It did so quietly, without ceremony, as if aware that its story was not meant to be announced, but uncovered. At first glance, it appeared ordinary weathered wood, cold steel, the familiar shape of a wartime firearm. There were countless rifles like it once, stacked in armories and slung over shoulders. But this one carried a weight that had nothing to do with its materials. Those who first examined it assumed the usual narrative. A soldier's weapon, a relic of conflict, another object to be catalogued, measured, and filed away. The war it came from had been studied relentlessly, its battles diagrammed and its strategies analyzed, yet the individuals who fought within it often remained faceless. This rifle was attributed to an indigenous sniper, a detail noted almost casually, as though it explained everything while explaining nothing at all. No name, no unit photo. Just a role assigned after the fact. As investigators handled the rifle, small inconsistencies began to surface. The stock bore marks that were not consistent with damage or repair. They were too smooth, too intentional. The balance of the weapon felt altered, subtly but unmistakably, as if something inside it shifted the center of gravity just enough to be noticed by someone paying close attention. Weapons experts remarked on it, but could not immediately explain it. The rifle functioned perfectly. There were no external modifications. Nothing about it should have raised suspicion, yet suspicion lingered. When imaging revealed hollowed sections within the stock, the room changed. What had been routine examination turned into careful observation. Every movement slowed. Every assumption was questioned. The cavities were not the result of decay or poor craftsmanship. They were shaped deliberately, carved with patience and skill. Someone had altered the rifle, not in haste, not out of necessity, but with intention. The discovery reframed everything. This was no longer simply a weapon recovered after a war. It was an object that had been chosen as a hiding place, or perhaps something more complex. The idea that a soldier, especially one operating alone, under constant threat, would modify his rifle in this way suggested planning that extended beyond combat. The rifle had been trusted with something important enough to keep close at all times. As the stock was opened, investigators expected evidence tied directly to warfare. Extra ammunition, maps, codes. Instead, they found objects that resisted immediate interpretation. Items that did not belong to the battlefield as it was officially understood. Their presence raised questions that could not be answered through military manuals or after-action reports. These were not tools of efficiency. They were personal, symbolic, intimate. The realization settled slowly. The rifle had not only been used to take lives or defend positions. It had carried memory. The objects inside were not hidden out of fear they would be taken, but because they were meant to remain unseen by anyone else. The rifle had been transformed into a container of meaning, something that traveled with the sniper through every engagement, every moment of waiting, every decision made in isolation. This challenged the simplified image of the sniper as a lone, emotionless figure defined only by precision. It suggested a person operating within a framework of belief and responsibility that existed long before the war and would continue after it. The rifle became an extension of that framework, merging the imposed role of soldier with an identity that could not be stripped away by uniform or command. As historians and cultural experts were consulted, fragments of forgotten narratives began to surface. Oral histories spoke of warriors who carried objects of protection, remembrance, and obligation into battle, not as superstition, but as continuity. War, in this understanding, was not an isolated event, but part of a longer story, one that required balance between taking action and honoring consequence. The rifle embodied that balance. Its outward appearance aligned with military expectations, allowing its bearer to move unnoticed within the structure of the army. Internally, it preserved something entirely different, something invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. The hidden nature of the contents mirrored the broader experience of indigenous soldiers, whose contributions were essential, yet often erased. Their identities acknowledged only when convenient and ignored when uncomfortable. What investigators found inside the rifle forced a reconsideration of what it meant for something to be forgotten. The sniper had not forgotten these items. He had safeguarded them through mud, snow, and fire. The rifle had not lost its secret by accident. It had kept it for as long as it needed to, waiting for a moment when someone would finally notice that the weight it carried was not just physical. Each object removed from the stock deepened the sense that this discovery was incomplete, not because pieces were missing, but because understanding lagged behind evidence. The rifle refused to be explained quickly. It demanded patience, context, and humility. It stood as proof that even in the most mechanized and documented conflicts, there were layers of human experience that remained untouched by official record. The forgotten rifle was no longer just an artifact of war. It became a question posed to the present. How many stories had been sealed inside ordinary objects, overlooked because no one thought to look closer? How many truths remained hidden not out of secrecy, but because history had never learned how to ask for them? Because the war ended on paper, while its meaning continued to live quietly inside things that survived it, waiting in silence for the moment when someone would finally understand that what had been found was only the beginning of something far larger, something that refused to be neatly concluded or fully explained, something that continued to unfold each time the rifle was lifted, examined, and recognized not just as a weapon, but as a witness to a story that had never truly been told, a story that still lingered within the hollowed wood, unresolved, enduring, and deliberately left unfinished. As if the hands that carved it had known that one day it would be found, but not finished, not answered, not closed, only opened far enough to reveal that what had been forgotten was never really gone, only waiting, preserved in silence, holding its breath, still listening, still watching, still asking whether anyone was truly ready to understand what had been carried through the war and left behind not as an ending, but as a trace, a signal, a reminder suspended in time, unfinished and unclaimed, resting just beneath the surface where it had always been, hidden, intact, and patiently alive, within the rifle, within the memory, within the space history forgot to look, where the discovery continued to echo without resolution, without permission, without a final word, lingering in the hollow where the story refused to stop, refused to end, and remained exactly where it was meant to be, waiting for whoever came next to look closer and realize that what they had found was not the secret itself, but the doorway left deliberately open, leading inward, deeper, further, into something that could not be summarized, concluded, or safely put away, because the moment it was uncovered, it began again and again and again, without ever reaching the point where it could finally be said that the discovery was complete, or that the forgotten rifle had finished telling what it carried inside, because it hadn't, and it wasn't, and it still isn't, and it continues to hold more than anyone has yet been able to take from it, quietly, endlessly, without ever offering the comfort of an ending. The weapon had always been described in practical terms: caliber, range, condition, confirmed usage. It fit neatly into the language of military record-keeping, where objects existed to serve a function and nothing more. But as soon as the rifle was understood to be altered from within, that language began to fail. A tool designed for distance and detachment had been reshaped into something intimate, something that stayed close, not just to the body, but to the inner life of the person who carried it. The realization unsettled those studying it, because it suggested the rifle was never only meant to fire a shot. For the sniper who carried it, the weapon was a constant companion, It was there in the stillness before dawn, in the long hours of waiting, in moments where action was postponed, not by orders, but by judgment. Unlike other soldiers, a sniper often worked alone, removed from the noise and immediacy of the front line. That isolation created space for thought, for memory, for doubt. In that space, the rifle became more than equipment. It became presence. The modifications inside the stock made that clear. No commander had ordered them. No manual recommended them. They were not meant to improve accuracy or durability. They served no tactical advantage that could be measured. Instead, they transformed the rifle into a container, one that held items chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with meaning. The weapon had been entrusted with things that mattered on a different level entirely. This dual purpose required balance. On the outside, the rifle had to remain unremarkable, indistinguishable from any other issued firearm. It had to pass inspections, blend in, avoid questions. On the inside, it carried reminders of identity, belief, and obligation. The sniper moved between these two worlds seamlessly, navigating military structure while preserving something deeply personal beneath its surface. Such a transformation did not happen accidentally. It reflected a worldview in which objects were not passive. Tools could carry intention. They could absorb experience. They could become witnesses. In many indigenous traditions, objects used daily are understood to hold the imprint of their use, the presence of those who rely on them. By hollowing out the rifle and placing these items inside, the sniper was not hiding them so much as integrating them into the object that defined his role in the war. Every shot fired, every position taken, every moment of restraint occurred with those items present, pressing silently against the wood. The rifle absorbed the contradictions of its purpose: protection and destruction, duty and consequence. It carried the weight of decisions made far from command tents and official records. Decisions that could not be explained afterward without losing their complexity. Investigators struggled with this idea because it resisted categorization. Museums wanted to display the rifle as a weapon. Military historians wanted to analyze its use. Cultural scholars saw it as something closer to a bundle, a personal assemblage of significance. None of these interpretations fully contained it. The rifle existed at the intersection of all three, refusing to be reduced to a single function. The sniper's choice to embed cultural and personal items within the weapon suggested an awareness of what the rifle represented in the eyes of others. To the army, it was property. To the enemy, it was a threat. To the sniper, it was also a burden, a responsibility that demanded grounding. The objects inside did not soften the act of war, but they contextualized it, anchoring action to identity. This challenges the common portrayal of snipers as detached or emotionally distant. Instead, it reveals a figure deeply engaged with the moral and spiritual weight of his role. Carrying a rifle that doubled as a vessel meant that every use of the weapon was accompanied by remembrance. The act of firing was not isolated from consequence. It was surrounded by it, enclosed within it. The rifle became a bridge between worlds that were often kept separate in official narratives. The world of tradition, where actions were tied to lineage and story, and the world of modern warfare, where actions were logged and quantified. The sniper stood between them, holding a single object that belonged to both. Over time, as the war ended and the rifle was separated from its bearer, its true nature went unnoticed. Without the person who understood its dual role, it appeared incomplete but unremarkable. Only when it was opened did its full purpose begin to surface, not as an explanation, but as an invitation to reconsider assumptions about what weapons can be and what they can carry. The discovery forced investigators to confront the limits of their frameworks. A rifle that served as both instrument and archive did not fit comfortably into existing categories. It required acknowledging that war is not experienced uniformly, and that for some, survival involved carrying more than gear and orders. It involved carrying selfhood into a system that often demanded its suppression. The weapon's internal contents suggested continuity rather than rupture. The war had not erased the sniper's cultural grounding. It had traveled with him, embedded in the very object that symbolized his participation in the conflict. The rifle became proof that even in environments designed to standardize and control, individuals found ways to remain whole. As the rifle passed through hands that no longer knew its story, its dual purpose lay dormant. Yet it remained intact, waiting not for recognition, but for the right kind of attention. When that attention finally arrived, it revealed not a contradiction, but a synthesis. The weapon had not been compromised by its hidden contents. It had been completed by them. This understanding reframed the rifle entirely. It was no longer just something that had been used in war. It was something that had carried war while carrying something else alongside it, something quieter but no less powerful. Something that shaped how the weapon was used and how its bearer moved through each moment of tension and choice. Something that made the rifle less a symbol of violence alone and more a record of how one person navigated the demands placed upon him without surrendering the core of who he was. A record that remained sealed until the moment someone finally looked beyond the surface and began to sense that the object in their hands was not finished speaking, not finished revealing, not finished holding the layered weight of a role that could never be singular, never simple, never confined to the function it was designed for, because within its wooden frame lived a second purpose that could not be separated from the first. A purpose that continued to exist quietly inside it, unchanged, patient, unresolved, still bound to the weapon, still present, still enduring, still waiting within the rifle as both tool and vessel, inseparable, intertwined, carrying forward a story that refused to settle into one meaning, one explanation, one role, and remained suspended in that tension, alive, unclosed, and ongoing. The official history of the war had been written with confidence. Dates were fixed, outcomes declared, and responsibilities assigned. Archives were thick with reports, after-action summaries, and commendations that framed the conflict as something fully accounted for. Within those pages, the war appeared orderly in retrospect, shaped into a sequence of causes and effects that suggested completeness. Yet the discovery of the rifle disrupted that sense of closure, not by contradicting specific facts, but by revealing how much those facts had failed to contain. Investigators quickly realized that nothing about the rifle aligned neatly with the established narrative. According to records, the sniper had been effective, disciplined, and compliant. His actions were measured in numbers and locations, his presence marked only when it intersected with operational needs. There was no mention of inner life, no acknowledgement of perspective. The rifle, however, told a different story, one that existed outside the margins of official documentation. What lay inside the weapon suggested that the war, as experienced by those who fought it, could not be reduced to strategy and outcome alone. The objects hidden within the stock did not appear anywhere in military archives, yet they had clearly been part of the conflict as it was lived. This created an uncomfortable gap between recorded history and lived reality, forcing investigators to confront the idea that the archives were not incomplete by accident, but by design. Official narratives often prioritize clarity and cohesion. They streamline complexity to make events understandable and manageable. In doing so, they leave little room for experiences that do not align with institutional frameworks. Indigenous soldiers, in particular, were frequently absorbed into broader units without acknowledgement of their distinct identities or motivations. Their stories were flattened into uniformity, their contributions noted without context, their losses tallied without understanding. The rifle resisted that flattening. It stood as evidence that something essential had been excluded. The sniper had not merely participated in the war as an interchangeable part of a larger machine. He had carried with him a set of beliefs, obligations, and memories that shaped his actions in ways no report could capture. The hidden contents of the rifle exposed that exclusion, making visible what the records had rendered invisible. Historians examining the discovery were faced with a dilemma. Accepting the rifle's significance meant admitting that the official account was not wrong, but insufficient. It meant acknowledging that accuracy in dates and figures did not equate to truth in experience. This distinction unsettled long-held assumptions about what it meant to document a war effectively. The challenge extended beyond military history into national memory. Wars are often used to construct narratives of unity and identity, emphasizing shared purpose while minimizing internal differences. The rifle undermined that simplicity. It revealed a participant who navigated the war through a lens shaped by a history that predated the nation-state, a history that did not dissolve when he put on a uniform. This realization raised questions about whose voices had been prioritized and whose had been sidelined. The sniper's story had not been lost because it lacked significance, but because there had been no established place for it within the dominant narrative. The rifle had preserved that story not in words, but in form, waiting for a moment when someone would recognize its challenge. The recorded narrative of the war emphasized cohesion, discipline, and command. The rifle suggested parallel narratives operating quietly alongside that structure. Narratives of negotiation, of internal reckoning, of carrying inherited responsibilities into a context that did not recognize them. These narratives did not disrupt the war's outcome, but they complicated its meaning. As scholars debated how to interpret the discovery, it became clear that the rifle could not simply be added as an interesting footnote. It demanded a re-examination of methodology itself. How many similar stories had been missed because historians relied too heavily on written records produced by institutions rather than individuals? How many artifacts sat in storage, cataloged but unread, because no one thought to question what they might contain beyond their obvious function? The rifle also highlighted the limitations of language used in official accounts. Terms like service, engagement, and neutralization created distance between action and consequence. The hidden items inside the weapon collapsed that distance. They implied a constant awareness of consequence, a refusal to separate action from meaning. This awareness did not fit comfortably within the language of reports, and so it had been excluded. Challenging official history does not require disproving it. The rifle demonstrated that challenge can occur through addition rather than contradiction. By introducing a perspective that had been omitted, it exposed the partial nature of the record. The war had been documented, but not fully understood. The implications extended beyond this single artifact. If one rifle could reveal such a gap, what might be uncovered by re-examining other objects, other testimonies long dismissed as anecdotal or irrelevant? The discovery encouraged a shift from viewing history as a closed account to seeing it as an ongoing conversation, one that required listening as much as recording. For descendant communities, the rifle was not a surprise. It aligned with stories that had been passed down quietly, stories that never found their way into textbooks. The shock lay not in the existence of such experiences, but in their sudden visibility to those who had long ignored them. The rifle forced an encounter between parallel histories that had coexisted without acknowledgment. In this sense, the discovery did not rewrite history so much as it disrupted its authority. It questioned who had the power to decide what counted as historical evidence and what did not. It suggested that silence in the archives did not equal absence in reality. The rifle's challenge remained unresolved. It could not be fully integrated into the existing narrative without altering that narrative structure. It resisted being explained away or neatly contextualized. Instead, It lingered as a reminder that history, as commonly presented, was often more fragile than it appeared, dependent on selective attention and institutional priorities, not by existing at the edge of the record. The rifle invited discomfort. It asked whether the goal of history was to finalize understanding or to deepen it, whether acknowledging complexity weakened collective memory or strengthened it, whether the past was something to be mastered or something to be continually approached with humility. As debates continued, the rifle remained unchanged, its challenge intact. It did not argue. It did not accuse. It simply existed as proof that the war had been lived in ways that exceeded its documentation, that beneath the clean lines of official history lay layers of experience that refused to stay buried, layers that surfaced not as conclusions, but as questions, pressing outward from within the object itself, unsettling, persistent, and unresolved, continuing to challenge every attempt to declare the story complete, every effort to seal the record, every claim that the past had been fully accounted for. Because as long as the rifle existed with its hidden contents revealed, the certainty of the official narrative remained open to doubt, open to revision, open to the quiet insistence that history was not finished speaking and had never truly been closed, only paused, waiting for someone willing to listen beyond what had already been written.